Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you so much for staying with us for 2 very meaningful days of some amazing conversations. This brings us to the final session of the workshop on methods of the Global South. And it's really a vital session because it's a session that looks toward the present and the future of labor, labor organizing and precarity, and really grapples with questions of what is the future of labor, particularly within the context of artificial intelligence, the digital economy, smart planning, and those kinds of imaginaries, and really asking how do we interrupt or disrupt those with questions of methods from the Global South. Once again, we have today with us 3 academics that have actually worked in these contexts of labor from a wide range of angles. Shaunak with his work with truck drivers in the informal sector in India, which has really, because of the neoliberal reforms that have been ongoing, has been largely disorganized because of sort of powerful forces. Satveer with her work in Singapore with migrant construction workers and foreign domestic workers, where an authoritarian state is organized with its repressive policies to actually silence labor organizing, even as it works toward projecting imaginaries of a smart future that offers quite a seduction for development conversations globally. And then Leon with his work with gig workers and workers in the precarious economy within the broader question of artificial intelligence and how it is impacting labor and the possibilities of labor organizing. So we will start with the first prompt, which is, what is the nature of precarious labor in the Global South? And we will begin with you, Satveer.
Thank you very much, Mohan, and everyone for having me here today. I look forward to this very interesting and important discussion. Just to sort of start off with talking a bit about the work that CARE has been doing in Singapore with foreign construction workers and migrant domestic workers. So this work we have been doing fieldwork since 2013, and I just sort of want to point to that because I want to talk about how these stories have not changed. They are repeated, they are reproduced, despite there being almost now about 9 years of migrant worker, of the kind of fieldwork that we have been doing in the migrant worker space. And despite changes, why are we still hearing the same types of stories? Why are they repeated and why are they being reproduced? So let me first begin with my understanding of precarious labor that will be built on, I think, by Shaunak and by Leon as well, to add to what do we think of precarization. So precarious labor and my understanding, or the ways in which we have come to make sense of precarious labor, is the ways in which the system, whether it is the macro system, so the international nature of how labor comes to be organized from a neoliberal perspective, whether it's state policies that organizes labor, and also then the micro practices of how labor is conducted. So how the system is organized to limit rights. You have Russell Paranas, who talks about how the system creates soft violence, for example, in the conditions of precarious labor. Mohan and my work on the ways in which precarious labor is formed through the system that creates immobile conditions. So immobile conditions can be both structural, but also very communicative, right? So the power relationship between employer and employee and the larger structure. Some ways in which the precarious labor conditions come to could be having a single sponsor that very much mimics the kafala system in the Middle East. So in Singapore, very similarly, migrant domestic workers are tied to a single sponsor, a single employer. And this means that oftentimes a lot of the power dynamics lies within the employer altogether. So having said that, I think that's where we sort of think about the ways in which precarious labor is organized such that it limits voice, it limits organizing, it limits opportunities to access facilities and systems for better human rights, for example. Mohan, do you sort of have anything to add at this point to this conversation?
Satveer, thanks for this and for setting this up this way. What I would like to add to this conversation is just to say that the state very much is integral to the organizing of precarious labor. So on one hand, you have the forces of the market, and we often talk about the market and capital and its networks of profiteering. But within the context of Singapore, the critical point to remember is the organizing of state capital, because the state is the site of capital. You have large corporations that are arms of the state or extensions of the state or connected to the state. And in that sense, the state's strategies of repression of labor are integral to the production of this precarity. So I just want to make visible the ways in which the state works within this condition. Thanks, Satveer.
Thank you, Mohan. Now, having sort of set that up in conversation of the more macro structures, I also then want to connect how discourse reproduces immobility. And when I say discourse, I refer to how mainstream discourses perpetuate the kinds of immobile conditions that migrant workers face. So while a bit of my later work sort of reflects on the ways in which the mainstream media in Singapore does a bit more work with humanizing migrant workers, especially during the COVID-19, where migrant workers in Singapore, more specifically construction workers, face disproportionate outbreak inequality compared to other populations in Singapore. And then we started seeing a lot more articles in the mainstream newspaper, or the ways in which discourses started to do a lot more humanizing work and starting to talk about structures. However, this is coupled with, as the pandemic went along, this idea of needing this labor because of how cheap it is, right? So the concept of cheapness of labor, coming back to the ways in which the body reflects a dollar value with precarious labor, becomes important because it also tells us the ways in which state ideology informs mainstream discourses and therefore reproduces the kinds of violence that takes place on the bodies of these workers. So I'm just going to stop there to see if anyone has anything else to add to mainstream discourses and immobility.
Great. Shaunak, do you want to take up from there?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Mohan, and thanks, Satveer, for setting it up so beautifully. You kind of really got to the crux of the matter in terms of thinking about the state, right? And its complicity in creating these conditions of precarity. Can you all hear me okay? I just want to make sure before okay, perfect. So, okay, to talk a little bit about my work in India with truck drivers. A lot of it was sort of focused around the context of HIV and the risk of HIV and how it's structured into the particular organizing of trucking as a profession. But to understand precarity in the context of the disorganized or unorganized sector, so-called unorganized sector in India, one really needs to take a step back and think about these sort of broad mechanisms through which precarity is produced. Right now, we know in a context like India, there is a lot of documented evidence for really precarious labor, right? At the point where what you would call bare life, right? I mean, we're still talking about labor that is a condition based on caste processes, right? Sort of the whole landscape of manual scavenging still existing as an acceptable practice, right? And so you think about precarity in the context of these sort of very basic depredations of humanity, and then I think it's important to locate trucking in its even as it produces its own precarities as within that kind of matrix of processes. So really, if I were to think, just broadly about what are the structures that sort of generate precarity, and so yes, of course, state policy. So in the context of truckers, a majority of truck drivers in India are like you mentioned, Satveer, are seasonal migrants. In this case, they are domestic migrants, not international migrants, but they're migrants who are very often seasonal agricultural labor who, due to a series of transformations in agriculture and land ownership and sort of policy making around agriculture, have found their labor and their bodies dispensable and have sort of been pushed out into these high risk occupations, right? So that is at that one macro level in terms of what produces precarity. There is policy, right? But intersecting that, there is the larger question of caste work. There is there are intersecting discourses of how the Indian economy sort of is based on developing urban centers at the cost of this sort of a rural influx, right? So there are those inequalities that play into it, but also fundamentally it is linked to the creation of the entrepreneurial self, which is sort of so deeply ingrained into trucking culture, and even more so since my fieldwork, which has been a while now. But and I think that is really interesting to think about how, in the absence of state-provided guarantees or employer guarantees, or on the account of truck drivers being sort of a unique case study, since they are not centrally employed or organized in India, and I'll talk about that in just a second to give a little context, that it makes them an interesting case study to look at how precarity is produced in the particular neoliberal atmosphere today. So for those of you who may not be aware of how trucking works in India, it is basically a multi-layered subcontractor system, right? So there is somebody who owns a number of trucks, and then based on how precarious and a laborer is, hands out these subcontracts. So people who actually do the trucking are far removed from things like ownership, from control, from timelines, and therefore also separated from employment guarantees, from negotiating for time-based assurances, and so they're at the mercy of the multiple layers of subcontracting. And so within this context, if you think about the agents of precarity, one of them is obviously these harsh sort of working conditions within which truck drivers operate. But there is also simultaneously, and I think this is a part of the my fieldwork that I really haven't written a lot about, because I haven't really sort of wrapped my head completely around it, is the production of the neoliberal self, right? Of doing sort of the gig that will allow you to quit the system, and that very old sort of trope of migrant work, right? That you're just doing this so that your children don't have to. And we see this in all these. We've seen this in your work. Mohan has talked about this in the Santali work, right? About doing precarious work in order to break the precarity chain, right? But that gesture, and that gesture of which we think and write of as agentic, right? That this is a form of agency, is also then interestingly interpolated in the context of the creation of this neoliberal self. That this is not just it no longer, trucking no longer becomes a stopgap that you do. It's no longer that poison pill, but it also then starts getting reinterpreted as a gig, right? And this is a really interesting kind of element of how the discourse around trucker safety, health, HIV has changed in the decade since sort of my HIV work with truckers in India. So there is both of these forces acting together. One, state-based sort of policy, but also, and not unrelated, is the creation of this neoliberal self. So I'll stop there, Mohan, if that's okay, and then I can answer. I can speak more if you need me to.
That's great, Shaunak, and that's a nice segue to you, Leon.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, the production of the neoliberal self is so spot on with our interviews, eh? Mohan. So, thank you for inviting me to this. This has been really great, and great to meet you, Satveer and Shaunak. Really interesting to hear about your research. You sound like you've got a lot more knowledge in this space than me, so I'd be really keen to learn more about your research. I'm relatively new to it. Myself and Mohan, to give you a bit of background, we started these interviews with New Zealand gig workers was it May last year?
Yes.
Or the end of lockdown last year. So we've been doing it for about a year. Now we've completed about 2021, with Mohan doing the first half, and then me kind of doing the rest, and me kind of learning Mohan's methodology from transcribing his interviews, learning the CARE methodology, which is quite specific and quite different to what I'm used to, but it's been great for me to learn about that. In terms of the specific prompts, what is the nature of precarious labour in the global south, is quite interesting, because we are looking at New Zealand, which is supposed to be in the global north, of course, so you could see it as a kind of provocation, but is the Uberification of the economy, is the gig economy, making us all into the global south? Is it making us who have been previously very privileged in the global north? Are we now experiencing what the global south has been experiencing for decades, even hundreds of years? And even, I work in a university, but I'm on a fixed term contract, and there are several scholars now as they're talking about the Uberification of the university, even that previously hallowed space, of the Enlightenment, critic and conscience role of the Western university, that linchpin of Western civilization. Even that's being kind of hollowed out now, and is becoming turned into a kind of extractive, exploitative platform that exploits both its workers and its students. And shows little in the way of kind of compassion or concern or responsibility to its workers or students, which is pretty much like the gig worker, the Uber platform. And so that kind of pretty problematizes this rosy picture we're getting here in the media in New Zealand of this great recovery, great economic recovery that we're supposedly experiencing, that we're quite quickly shrugging off the post-pandemic downturn in the economy. And so, I was really interested what you were talking about, Satveer, with state complicity, and you, Shaunak, as well. The state is central space of the state in these kind of precarious economies, because I think that's definitely the case. Although in New Zealand at the moment, the state has continually refused to kind of implement any regulations around the gig economy. They were talking about it a year ago, and then they were kind of like, oh, then COVID hit, so we can't do anything now. And I think it actually suits them quite nicely, because of course the unemployment statistics aren't reflecting the reality of people actually in kind of desperate situations, working in exploitative gig worker jobs, often as second jobs. As a part-time, they're working as a second job, working part-time, doing Uber driving, driving people around, taking them home from pubs and bars at 3 o'clock in the morning after working on like a 9-to-5 job during the day. what was I? And so that we're all becoming kind of gradually used to this this experience of precarity, this experience of precarious working conditions, non-secure working conditions. We're becoming used to not having sick pay, annual leave, union representation. It's a kind of gradual process. And what you were saying, Shaunak, is that production of the neoliberal self. I'm very much getting that from our interviews. People are kind of working these second jobs. They're working their 9-to-5 jobs, and they're doing the gig work in the evening to save up to buy a house. I don't know if you've heard about the astronomical property prices in New Zealand. As you say, like around the corner, they're going to be able to get away from gig work and just do one more year of Uber driving or something, and they'll get to that promised land. Yeah, I was just going to finish off because First Union have done a survey of 100 gig workers, New Zealand gig workers, and the results are that 52.8% are earning less than the minimum wage. Over 60% said a sudden $500 bill would be difficult or very difficult to pay. Of course, they can rack up huge amounts of expenses, they take on all the risks. They buy an expensive car like a Prius that can cost like $15,000, and they can be deactivated at like a moment's notice with one complaint from one customer, and they've got no recourse whatsoever. So yeah, very precarious position for a lot of people. Yeah, so shall I end there?
Thank you so much, Leon. So there's a lot that is actually flowing through your conversations. One is the idea of the state, but of course that connected to the production of particular form of identity. And within that, the one point I want to push is this notion of gigness. And of course, you see this also in low-wage migrant workers in Singapore, right? Satveer, and please feel free to jump in. They talk about this being a gig, like I am selling the land, selling white jewelry, because I'm going to go to Singapore and make enough money to come back. The question is when the gig becomes bonded labor, which is that now because I have taken up the debt, once I am in Singapore, I cannot go back, and I feel like I'm enslaved in a prison and I cannot get out of this, and I have to keep coming back to it because there is all this debt that I have to pay. So, it's really interesting in terms of that communicative inversion, the gig being emancipatory and yet the gig being the basic trap, right? That is the cycle.
I want to say one thing about that, Mohan, real quick. I feel, can I just jump in real quick about that? So, just thinking historically about migrant work, right? And in some ways, precarious migrant work from the global south has always depended on that hedging of that bet, right? That there is going to be, I'm going to make it big, right? So whether these are like in the 1970s, truck drivers who went to Canada, right? Or people who went to the Middle East, right? Or even, we can go historically back. We can think about like people who in the first wave after independence, Indian workers who went to the UK. We can sort of stretch that tapestry back. I think what is interesting, like you said, is now that gesture of desperation of doing that, making that bet, has now got a language. There's now become an acceptable language of the gig to sort of legitimize that and sort of connect that to, this is no longer just a hedge. Now it's like, it's a thing, right? So like you have truckers who say, well, I have, at least I'm azadi, free, I'm free. I'm not an employee, I'm not linked to the land, I'm free. Because that language has become so available and so easily available. It has become so seductive. The idea of the gig. I choose my hours. I do my, so I think that's it. I want to almost say it's the opposite. It's not that the gig has become the bonded labor. The bonded labor has now got a language of accessibility that it can latch on to. So that premise of migrant labor has been so ruthlessly in some way, but seductively captured by gigification or Uberification or whatever you call it. It is.
Yeah, can I jump in?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think it's something to do with that Silicon Valley ideology, that liberal ideology, and or that neoliberal ideology that you call it? Yeah. The gig workers that we've spoken to, Mohan, a lot of them have really internalized that. And you were talking about the trap. They get them in with these seemingly great working, like flexible working conditions and good pay. They can earn $80 an hour or what have you. And then because of the power imbalance and that they kind of have a contract, but they don't have a contract, and Uber just sets all the terms of that contract, and they have no negotiation, they have no bargaining. They either accept it or they don't. It's like, terms and conditions on an Apple app or something, like you either say no, yes or no. And then so Uber can then change those conditions, reduce their rates of pay, do what they want completely, but they become completely trapped because they're totally reliant on that income stream, even though it's diminishing.
Yeah. The one thing I want to add quickly, and Satveer, I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well, is that, what you're saying about this being the seduction also has another element to it. And this is sort of the longitudinal nature of the work, Shaunak, that, when I was, the first set of interviews I was doing with migrant workers in Singapore was in 2008. So it has really been 13 years. And in this 13-year span, there is something else that has changed, which is that in the narrative accounts then, we used to actually materially have evidence of a worker that has made the money to go back home and build something or do something. That is no longer possible in 2021. So I think we need to be very attentive of what is that kind of material shift that has happened, Satveer, did you want to add to that?
So that's very interesting. I wonder as I said, to me, doing this field work from 2013 right up till yesterday, the stories are not changing. So for example, speaking of this idea of going back, of doing this for a while and then going back, that doesn't even happen because, for example, just a very ordinary story of a conversation I had yesterday. A domestic worker comes to Singapore, is unable to get along with her employer. She has a nasty employer, very simple, like their differences. It's not physical abuse. It's just differences and a nasty employer that uses verbal abuse. It should be as simple for the domestic worker to get out of that situation. She's only been here 6 months, which means she's still paying off her debt. To be able to get out of that situation or that contract and be able to transfer an employer, right? But the idea of being sponsored to one employer, again, this conversation has cropped up again and again, right? Now she has to go back. She has no choice. There's no option. And I don't understand how, despite there being a third mechanism, which is the state agency or the NGO, knowing that this is a simple situation of transferability, especially within this context of COVID, where the demand for domestic workers are much, much higher than the supply. So they should be in the larger sense of demand and supply patterns, right? There should be greater power and agency at this point for a domestic worker to make those negotiations, but rather this domestic worker is going to have to go back to Punjab and come back again a year later. And pretty much make nothing from this process because she's still in the process of paying agency fee over a simple dispute within the employer context. This is not even a case of extreme violence or just a simple non-resolution within the employment context. So what does this sort of tell us in terms of what does precarization look like today for these workers? Yeah.
So Satveer, this is what I was thinking of when writing about this for the American Behavioral Scientist special issue on migration, saying that it seems like the state today, and this is a fairly recent configuration, that the state is organized as a cruel state. That it's like the state takes pleasure and relishes its cruelty and its ability to carry out cruelty on the precarious classes. So that's a particular kind of organizing. So it could intervene there, but it won't, because it enables it to be cruel and actually work to catalyze and manifest that power inequality, doesn't it?
And how that then gets reproduced.
Satveer, you're muted.
And how that gets trickled down and reproduced at the micro levels of employer-employee relationships, because how this cruelty sort of surfaces within this interpersonal relationships that exist between employer and employee seems to be one that the employer is confident that they have the ability to send the domestic worker back no matter what. The ability to do so and bypassing any sort of confrontation or any sort of a mechanism seems to me that this is how it gets reproduced at the micro levels with domestic work. Yeah.
Great. Shall we move on to the next prompt, which is, what are the key threads of methods when studying precarity in the global south? Perhaps we can start with you, Shaunak, then Leon, then Satveer.
Sure. So this is an interesting one in terms of what does it mean to do this work. Besides the usual sort of ethnographic caveats of trying to know or go in with the idea of knowing precarity from a sort of voyeuristic third-person perspective, there are also pragmatic and real challenges in understanding how to almost kind of fix that precarity into meaningful, understandable concepts for an academic audience, right? So truckers, right, Mohan, compared to other forms of informed or informal labor in India, many truckers don't do that badly, right? But that's because the floor is so low, right? So if you're involved in manual scavenging, being a long distance trucker in comparison is not economically precarious, correct? I mean, if you think about it, think about it relatively. So one of the challenges is to make the precarity apparent by contextualizing it within its sort of life world, right? So one of the arguments in my work, right, is that the key risk for HIV for truck drivers is precisely this structurally located employment-based challenges. That it is HIV risk is structured into trucking in India precisely because of the mechanisms through which they are denied access to things like unionization, through ownership, through control, all of these kind of factors, right? So part of my biggest challenge was how to make this legible, or how to make it how to transform these sort of narratives in a register that was apparent to an outside audience, if it were, right? So part of that and that was for me was a methodological challenge, because it meant to sort of unpack how I was entering the field and how I was interacting with participants, how I was translating or interpreting their stories, right? So part of that is reflexive work, but it is also sort of deeply implicated in how you collect the data, what are the politics of that data collection, and to not sort of, and this is the greatest challenge, is to not go in with sort of this monolithic ideal of who the subaltern is, right, or of who the participant is, because it is those complexities of what precarity means and how to make that precarity legible is where I found sort of the most personal sort of challenge in translating that, if that makes sense at all.
Absolutely. So what does that reflexive work look like, particularly in terms of, interrogating that monolithic idea of who the subaltern is, right? I mean, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I had the answer. I think part of it is also, and this becomes particularly challenging in the context of trucking, is data collection that or research that is not a one-time encounter. And this is sort of part of the challenge with my early trucker work, was that they are so mobile that unless this work is supported by mechanisms that allow researchers to actually keep in touch, use mechanisms, use methodologies that allow for a sustained long-term really accompaniment, right? You really get sort of a discombobulated abstract idea of what precarity is, right? You sort of get it's a snapshot, and it's a snapshot that is also produced for a certain kind of researcher, right? I mean, truckers are also highly studied now in India. They are very sort of they are a subject of epidemiological curiosity. So there is also the expectation that you go in looking for a narrative and you will find that narrative, right? So there is the challenge is to do the work with sustained engagement in the field. That's one. But the other is also to recognize that, to go back to what your point was about material changes, how the sort of the material changes in what that work means has led to the condition that truckers find themselves today, right? So, I mean, you cannot really write about trucking unless you know the history of the dismantling of trucker unions, right?
Yeah.
So for a lot of people, trucking was still highly respectable, a very respectable job. It had connections to industry, it had connections to, right? There was this kind of romance to it, and it was a path to middle class kind of occupation, right? I can see they were nodding ahead, but that dismantling, and that is again state plus corporate kind of input, right? Where you don't have unions, you have foundations which are owned by these large transporters, right? Which is so the people who own the trucks then control the chicken coop, so as to speak. So part of that method is to make that politics or that history apparent, that you can't talk about the suffering without that structural context. The transformation of, yes, trucking as a viable alternative historically, the destruction of that framework, and then now the precarity where there is such a rut or such a glut of labor for such few jobs.
Thank you. So,
I sort of just want to come in very quickly here to sort of talk a bit about what Shaunak mentioned about sustained engagement. For our work, right, this has been a very interesting and unique challenge and presents to us new opportunities for thinking about where the subaltern is talking or where the subaltern is speaking. In the context, again, I think the context of Singapore's precarious migrant labor because of how it's structured and organized, it's always erased. So whenever there is engagement, whenever there is interaction, it's going to find a way to get erased, right? And this was very much true during the COVID-19 pandemic, when there was the outbreak inequality with migrant workers. So now how do we then keep up this sustained engagement? Sustained engagement remains very, very important, because it gives us deeper insight into now where they continue to talk about labor conditions, where they continue to reflect on the ways in which they are being treated. So they might not be, the first point of contact, of course, is conversations, but that might not be the best way to sort of access those data points. So while having conversations during the COVID-19 pandemic, and Mohan, if you want to jump in here as well, during your conversations with migrant construction workers, it was very challenging, because now, again, coming back to the smart nation dichotomy, right, for migrant workers versus the local population, migrant workers, while having mobile phones, were not able to use it, were constantly under surveillance. So you couldn't do your interviews, you couldn't do your observations as you would typically do, or the typical methods you would employ, right? But what was interesting was the ways in which migrant workers were pointing to me about where they were speaking. And this could be on TikTok videos. I found TikTok videos to be especially valuable data points, because they not only tell, they show the conditions that we couldn't see, that you don't see, you will never see in mainstream discourse or in mainstream spaces. Also then engaging a whole variety of different hidden spaces online became an important point of contact. Voice notes on the mobile phone, for example, were easy ways to get access to those data points. So I don't know, again, how much longer we might have to use some of these techniques, but I think it's important for CCA method to start thinking about expanding methods to the digital as well, and also what ways in which we can capture that. Yeah.
Satveer, I will just make a quick addition. I'm so glad you talked about this. So most of the ways in which CARE intervened and our work intervened into those conditions was through the generation of the white papers, which got picked up all the way from the Guardian to the Time, and created really pressure points for the state along with the works of the activists. And one of the things, if you will recall, we were able to do is connect migrant workers with journalists, not only presenting the white paper, but actually connecting migrant workers to journalists and doing the translation work with them to bring those narratives, right? So you talk about TikTok. For me, a lot of it was WhatsApp. Building the connections on WhatsApp, but also knowing how to delete. And at that level, in that register, there was no signal and, the kind of privacy issues that we talk about. WhatsApp is the one that worked, but what we did we would immediately delete the traces of the conversations, delete the videos as ways of doing it. But also things like finding timing, like a worker would sneak into his room to demonstrate that there were 20 workers that were staying in a room as I'm talking to a journalist to give us a video snapshot, but doing it at a time of the day where he could actually do that in spite of surveillance, right? So a lot of this also then, I suppose, relates to the strategies of really strategizing about method, right? What do you make visible? What do you make invisible? And what kinds of channels you use to do that, right? Leon, go ahead, Satveer. Did you want to add something?
No, I just wanted to say, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Satveer, I remember, without disclosing much, all those images that were being circulated, and there was so much repression because Singapore, if you know about the Singapore model, it's a state that cares a lot about its image. I mean, Singapore model thrives on that image of that AI future, right? And here you had images of toilets that were overflowing with filth, So there was a lot of surveillance around it, but also workers found ways of disrupting and dismantling that surveillance. Leon, did you want to add? I know, Shaunak, you have added the Chinese government watches worker WeChat with such precision. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and made me think of, like in Western nations, we like to think of ourselves as so kind of free, and we don't have these kind of state oppressions. But it made me think of Amazon in the US when you talked about overflowing toilets, right? When they were being forced to wee into the Amazon workers being forced to wee into bottles because they weren't allowed proper breaks, and that kind of, and when you were talking about Satveer about the going into digital methods, that really sounds interesting, because I'm from a media studies background, and I was just struck, talking to the gig workers, the New Zealand gig workers, how reliant they are on the Facebook groups. A lot of our recruitment, most of our recruitment was through these Facebook groups, actually finding the participants, because it's gig workers, Uber drivers and delivery drivers, they don't have a physical space, and Uber's actually, they used to have these hubs, Uber, and now they've closed those hubs. There used to be places where drivers could go to have their issues resolved, their administrative issues resolved with Ubers, their complaints, and their applications and that kind of thing. But now Uber's just closed all of those. So now their only way of contacting Uber is now through AI bots. Like there's not even a customer service line in New Zealand where they can speak to a human being, and so the gig workers in New Zealand are completely reliant on these Facebook groups as their support networks, because of course as well they don't meet other Uber drivers. They're very isolated, very atomized from each other. They might meet some if they're doing airport runs at the airport and that kind of thing, but otherwise and that's what, like, normally we try and do the snowball method for recruitment, but like a lot of these drivers would say, like, do you know other Uber drivers who might be interested? And a lot of them just said, no, I don't really know many other Uber drivers. They're totally kind of isolated and atomized from each other, so they're totally reliant on these Facebook groups. So yeah, I'd love to do some kind of analysis of these Facebook groups, of how they kind of provide a community. There's lots of different ones. There's national ones and there's local ones for different cities, and a lot of the posts are kind of they post kind of like a screenshot of how much money they've made on a good day, or how badly they've done on a bad day, and so they kind of they support each other. It often doesn't kind of snowball into anything more significant politically. It's often kind of quite it's quite contained. And talking about surveillance, there's a lot of rumors that Uber's monitoring these pages as well, so they can't complain too much. The next day they might be suddenly deactivated. So yeah, lots of interesting parallels there.
I have a interesting and kind of dystopic story about that, Leon. At the outset of COVID, I was in China actually with my family, and as the virus kind of by mid-April and May, situation got better. We would take a lot of Ubers around the city where my spouse lives, and so we would take Didi, which is a Chinese equivalent of Uber, and which bought out Uber, and we would take the posh Didi, because whatever the more expensive one or whatever. And so they had this is interesting in terms of labor, Mohan. So they had an AI voice detector in the vehicle, and that each driver, within the first minute of the passenger entering, had to recite a script, and that script was, the vehicle has been sanitized at this time today. I have personally done it. Please wear your seatbelts. It is a lot. So they had the script.
Oh my God.
And we would ask every time, like, why do you? And because it was so rehearsed, and they would say it records just for the first minute, and it is completely AI driven. There's no person on the other side. But if you don't hit those 7 keywords, automatically you already get into a system where at 3 strikes, you're out of the system for a month. And these are people who've taken out these huge loans because they're these fancy Volkswagen cars or whatever. So there is no human at all in this system. It is just this AI, right? Yeah. But what is interesting, but here are the cracks, Mohan. So after a minute, that thing would stop recording. So they could say whatever they want. So then they would be like shitting on the system. Sorry. So it is so bizarre that it is such a surveillance kind of regime. And each of them would do it because they said there are all of them knew one story of somebody who had been suspended just based on an AI word count filter.
And did they have to, did they have to take a selfie of themselves with the mask on as well? Yeah.
All the time. They had, at random times, the camera would take a picture of them. If they were not wearing a mask, if the customer was not wearing a mask, they would be penalized. It was out of control. I mean, talk about draconian interventions at COVID. That's a whole new topic. But your comments about being atomized and being sort of controlled by AI, it's reminded me of this kind of experience.
And the AI making human behavior more AI-like, right? It's interesting.
You know, Leon, I just want to add another thing. So what is really interesting, and this to me was mind-boggling, was when we were doing these interviews, realizing for the first time that there might not be a physical Uber location in Aotearoa at all. Right, so for the worker, it's an employer that is practically not there, right? It's you don't know how to contact it, how to connect with it, how to bring your grievances. And it was really interesting. I remember one driver talking about potential sexual harassment while driving, and what are the kinds of protections and where do you go? There is absolutely no legal structure,
No, but at the same time,
because it's a contract, right? Go ahead, Leon.
No kind of contact, but at the same time, still that control at that micro level, isn't there? It's over their actions and even their thoughts. Yeah.
Shall I move to the third prompt? So the third prompt is, how do methods from the Global South engaged with questions of precarity offer transformative registers for a socialist politics? We will begin with you, Leon, particularly with your union work, and perhaps you could also outline what we are trying to do with the unions,
Yeah, I mentioned briefly, we have a kind of collaboration going with First Union here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I got in touch with them because they were running a survey with gig workers, a quantitative survey. So our qualitative interviews kind of tally up together quite nicely. And they've been trying to organise in the gig worker space for a few years as well. And they've been trying to support that. At one time, there was this Uber drivers rideshare drivers network that started up. It was just some Uber drivers were trying to self-organize, but of course they're just so busy and they're just so kind of just trying to make a living, trying to make ends meet all the time, that they didn't really get off the ground. Tasks were left to each other, and they didn't, when they did some interviews, media interviews and that kind of thing, but they weren't really trained or prepared for that kind of thing. And then of course a lot of them got jobs elsewhere because it's just not a sustainable job long term being an Uber driver. So it's kind of dissipated, but they're still trying to organise in this space. They're still trying to lobby government to kind of change the legislation, create more regulations and protections. Yeah, in regards to the transformative registers for socialist politics, I guess, Mohan, you'd probably agree, New Zealand socialist politics can be very fractured and quite kind of factional. You've got from like your structural Marxists, where everything can be kind of explained through Marxist theory, through to the Green Party kind of moderate, more establishment. But even though they can be kind of dominated by this Wellington-based vanguard kind of middle class kind of perspective that's quite separated from these kind of voices, you know, so it's really great to bring in these kind of the voices of reality in this work that we're doing, because they can be quite kind of the middle class, white middle class, university educated, think they know best the socialist movements here, and the union movement can be quite kind of a bit kind of stuck in that model of the 9-to-5 permanent job, which is rapidly disappearing because of the gig economy. You know, their model, partly because they're so reliant on the membership, the membership subscriptions for their kind of survival. Their funds funded completely, unions in New Zealand are funded completely on membership subscriptions, so they become kind of structurally reliant. They have to play to their base in a way, you know. They have to satisfy those people that pay their wages, so it can make them in quite inherently conservative organizations, and it is quite hard for them to then, you know, take the chance to go and kind of organize rideshare workers, you know, who are often quite skeptical of the union movement. They're like the ones that we've spoken to, me and Mohan, are like, so what? They don't really see what the union. A lot of them don't really see what the union movement can do for them, what union representation could do for them. They, as you said, Shaunak, they've very much got that neoliberal ideology where they're just out for themselves, see things from a kind of very individualist perspective. It's selling, although we try selling them that kind of collectivity as a collective power is often quite difficult. But yeah, I mean, there's a real need for unions here to kind of meet gig workers halfway. I think maybe kind of adapt their model somehow, I think. Otherwise, they're going to lose even more relevance than what they've already lost. And I think there's going to have to be a lot more international thinking from socialists and the union movement as well. I mean, because yeah, gig economy, gig companies like Uber are international in their scope. If you do manage to push through some kind of changes, some legislative changes, as we've seen in the UK recently, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to just because things get better in the UK with that High Court ruling doesn't mean it's going to get better for everyone everywhere. In fact, they're going to just keep going. They're probably going to put even more money into their PR teams and their expensive lawyers to make sure that kind of thing isn't going to happen in other countries. And yeah, and the gig economy is just expanding. It's here to stay. And it's going to get bigger and bigger. It's going to have a huge impact on the ability of unions to fight for better conditions, and so it needs to be. Action needs to be now. In 5 years, it's going to be too late. Yeah, that's me really.
Thanks, Leon. Shaunak, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to respond in the context of trucking specifically, and what possibilities of transformation exist. And part of me is kind of like real talk is that they don't at this point, precisely because of just how entrenched some of these discourses have become. So, and when I say that, I mean, trade unionism or labor unionism in India is not absent, right? There is still a large union movement. However, with trucking specifically, I think what has worked in other countries. So for me, I still think of so much of trucking is based and the sort of public discourse around trucking and concerns about trucking emerge in the context of accidents, physical injury, and HIV, right? Those are the three kind of main buckets through which people understand the precarity of that work. And so in places where the organizing has been around health, right, in terms of safety, road safety, assurance, removing some of those precarity markers, that's kind of been where you've seen improvements in some of these indications of job security or assurance. So there's some work from Karnataka in India where there's some limited evidence that establishing job security and assurance, working towards safety, also has these kind of downstream benefits, right? With regards to health and with regards to security. But the problem also with with trucking, like in the context of so much HIV interventions, is the gatesification of it, right? The idea of the peer worker, the trucker who's now become someone who's employed by a subsidiary of the Gates Foundation to produce the particular kind of narrative, right? So in that sense, that model doesn't really relate to transformation. It sort of reifies the figure of the trucker as this sort of hypersexual, impulsive, illiterate, apolitical figure who's in it for himself, like the gig, the production of that gig. So from what I have read and seen around truck driver interventions in different contexts, so work from Kenya, work from Pakistan, is that in that case, in that sense, health and safety is the gateway drug for trucker interventions. Like you emphasize safety, and that offers perhaps some orientation towards assurance and removing some links in the precarity chain. But it really, as Leon said, requires a fundamental rethinking of what socialist politics even mean in the context of this rampant Uberification, right? Like, what does that look like? And that's a tough one, Mohan. I don't know if I have an answer to that.
Thank you, Shaunak. Satveer?
So this is a hard question, but where I think I might be gathering some insight, especially a hard question because the context of the work that we are doing with migrant workers is in authoritarian context where there's absolutely no space for union organizing, right? So what could then transformative politics look like? So looking at the history and looking at the context, if the host country is not behaving, right, then what have been the ramifications from the sending countries? So Indonesia, if I've got this data correct, very recently started saying, look, the agency fee needs to be entirely borne by the host country or the employers in the host country, right? You need countries, sending countries to start stepping up to getting the host country to behave responsibly towards their workers, right? And then you had Myanmar, who placed a moratorium on its workers from coming to Singapore to do domestic work specifically because of the intensification of violence faced by Burmese workers. That moratorium was lifted, right? And then now again, very recently, we saw the Burmese domestic worker that was unfortunately murdered by her employers. So how can we look to therefore sending countries to be much more engaged with precarious workers and their organizing? And then you have now the COVID-19 situation that has created a supply problem from India, right? And then Singapore is going to struggle with getting workers because they often looked at, because of the neoliberal model of the cheapest labor, right? China has become very competitive, and their workers are working within the Chinese context. They prefer to work within the Chinese context. So having Chinese workers now come to Singapore is much more competitive. So looking at all of these different models or different ways in which sending countries can enact strategies to get host countries to behave might be part of that possibility. But also, is there room for then international labor organizations like ILO to start setting out more harsher sort of guidelines for countries that continue to behave poorly with regard to how they treat their precarious workers? Yeah, these are a few of the things that I'm thinking about, because I think in this context, it's very hard to imagine what are the possibilities of transformation just within the country context, the country specific context.
So the internationalism is really important, as you outlined, and working across those linkages and connections. And that goes to something Leon was saying as well, that, you know, it is really thinking through what is going on internationally within the context of the gig economy, right? Something else, it seems like, is that if this is what the future is going to look like, right? That the future is going to be increasingly more and more precarized, including in academia, including the nature of work that we do. I guess there are sort of two questions. I don't think we have an answer right now, but two questions worth thinking about is that, what do we do to organize now to prepare? That is a question for us, I think, as researchers within the context of Global South. And maybe there are many lessons that the South can offer. Like what you're saying, Shaunak, is that in many precarious contexts in the Global South, unions continue to thrive and have continued to find ways of building membership, creating creative responses in spite of state control and reorganizing the state. So maybe, you know, there are lessons for the South, from the South, lessons to lead and lessons to percolate in that sense, and which relates to what are the kinds of things that unions and collective movements need to learn now, preparing for the future. And again, what kinds of repositories and learnings do we have from the South? Satveer, I want to come back to one thing, and I think this is beautiful. You know, when I was interviewing the workers, and we were doing this poetry work, right? So in a lot of the poems, as they were crafting them, you actually have verses of collectivization and unionization. So it's really interesting, because under the radar, sort of invisible to the structures of the state, there are articulations that are quite powerful in terms of labor and labor rights that keep alive that possibility. So, you know, there might be multiple registers that are not yet visible and legible, and that yet offer imaginary possibilities, no? I do wonder if our audience has any questions. We have one audience in the form of Mary at this point here.
Look, I would just like to thank you all for sharing that work. At one level, it was deeply depressing. And I don't use Uber because of what they do. And in Wellington, I use Zoomy, even though that's because that's owned by taxi companies, and at least I can support that because I know it's a cooperative. But it seems like it's a race to the bottom. And then to hear about truck drivers in India, and because of their conditions, there's this risk of HIV. I'm thinking, what is going on? You know, and then the ongoing difficulties or challenges rather for domestic workers, migrant domestic workers. It's really frightening. So thank you for sharing that. I would like someone to give me an optimistic note on which to finish, if that's at all possible, please.
We will go to Debashish for an optimistic note.
Good idea.
Well, I'm always optimistic. I mean, there is always hope. And I think, yeah, so many communities are working to dismantle some of these structures. And I think the hope is that lots of communities are working and researchers are working with them. And that's what gives us hope.
Hey, Mohan, I will say one thing, which is sort of interesting. I mean, if you look at, I don't know how tuned you are on, right, with the US fast food retail situation. What we're seeing today is perhaps the largest informal general strike in American, like the 50 years of US retail labor history, because every fast food chain, every retail establishment across the Midwest, across the US is hiring. And that big bogey of the $15 an hour, that fear that you could never raise the minimum wage. You see McDonald's now openly offering $18 an hour, asking children, like telling parents to come, their children to get to work, because there are people who are there recognizing this is a dead-end job, right? That there is so much supply pressure right now in the US fast food market that in some way, and it's what some sort of labor organizers I was reading were mentioning, this is the closest that perhaps the US economy will come to the idea of the hartal, right, of the strike, that we will just not work. There is so much pressure now in the retail industry in the US to hire. And because of the so-called Biden stimulus, there is such reluctance to join these minimum wage jobs that there is perhaps now a window to think about what does it look like, or what does that pressure look like to these corporations who have been fighting even the most like minimal $15 an hour giveaway minimum wage. So it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if it's optimistic, but it certainly is interesting to think about. That pressure still works, right? Like there are ways to create pressure, as we are learning in the most bizarre ways in the US today.
Thanks, Shaunak. Aminul, were you trying to say something?
Can I say something?
Yes, go for it, Debo.
Okay. You know, in India, we've spent the last couple of years being very unhappy and getting steadily unhappier, right, with all of this that is happening around us. And it seems that, you know, systems are not going to provide ways out. Institutions and systems are not going to provide, you know, ways of care, thinking about other people, support. This is not going to come from institutions anymore. It will have to come from us. And we will have to support each other, and we will have to do that as best we can. And I don't know if I can call that hope, but I think knowing that is, knowing that helps, knowing that, you know, we have to be that way. We have to think of our lives that way. We have to think of our lives as community, and that we will have to be there for each other, because the state is not going to be there for us. And again, I don't know if it's hope, but in some ways it's good to know what you're in for. I mean, that's a better state to be than not to know. So that's my half hope.
We have to build solidarity amongst the researchers. I mean, people who've been here for the last couple of days, for instance, and there's, I think that's where the hope comes from, for academics to researchers to be helping each other and building those networks of solidarity, especially when it comes to challenging institutional structures, especially the institutions that we are ourselves a part of.
What a powerful point, Devashi.
Anis is written in the chat.
So this is what Anis has written. Thanks all the panelists and the chair. I understand academic workers in the Western countries are much more privileged than gig workers. But as Professor Datta said, precarity is severely extending to academia, and the universities are becoming gig academy. More than 70% in the US and 54% in Canadian higher education institutions are contract instructors. Just wanted to point this out in solidarity with your very important work with the most marginalized communities. What a great point. Absolutely. And this goes to something that Debashish just said in terms of how do we build that the context of solidarity with each other and supporting each other. And that's a great way also for me to draw in something that I wanted to do as a way for wrapping up, is to point out for those of us that do this work sort of in ways that actually challenge structures. There are many that are actually pushed out of structures. We have experienced this firsthand in the work of CARE. And of course, the ones to experience this most directly are the most precarious. I can say that within the span of 3 years, most of CARE researchers that were in Singapore have been pushed out of institutional structures very deliberately and being placed in the places of precarity. So it's a real question, and it's a hard question. What does solidarity look like? And particularly when what it means in terms of standing beside those that actually have gone on to place their bodies on the line,
Yeah, I'll just go back to that, the point that Anis was making about as a precarious academic worker myself, and the point that Devalina was making about the kind of the reality, having to kind of get to grips with the brutal reality. I've actually got a paper coming out soon with a group of tertiary education activists. I'm part of this tertiary education activist group, Aotearoa, and we're writing a paper on this specifically about how it can actually, that kind of mourning that kind of fantasy of the early career academic, the idea that in your post PhD you have to kind of go through a couple of years of precarity, and then you've got the permanent job, the tenured academic job waiting for you, kind of. And the COVID-19 pandemic and the reaction that the New Zealand universities had to that, which was basically saying that you guys are expendable, everyone, casual academics and fixed term academics, you guys are expendable and we'll just get rid of you. Was that, although it was painful for a minute, it was actually really productive, and that it brought us together as an activist group, and we were able to kind of get to grips with that reality that we are, and shed that kind of fantasy identity of the early career academic, and then that will enable, once we've got to grips with that new identity, that then enables more relations of solidarity with other groups that are more like us, which is like gig workers, cleaners, security, rather than tenured academics, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Wow, Leon. So Leon, I want to ask you a question with regard to that. So in your activism then, what would a reconfigured academia look like? So what are the kinds of demands you would have from academia to reorganize it so that it would be sustainable?
Yeah, that's yeah, that's a tough one. I guess I guess some kind of, like I don't think there are many other sectors where you do an apprenticeship, like the PhD is supposed to be an apprenticeship, and then you've got no career path after that. You go through the 3-year kind of PhD apprenticeship, and then where other apprenticeships, like in construction or a trade or something, you would take the low pay for 3 years with the promise then you'd be qualified to be to earn good money as a tradesperson after that. But the PhD, there's no guarantees whatsoever after that. So I guess, some kind of guarantee that once you've done that, your PhD actually leads to something, and just kind of proper research funding. So the research funding is abysmal in New Zealand. So yeah, just some proper research funding, and a research funding body that just looks after the social sciences and the humanities and the arts, rather than at the moment what we've got is just like the Marsden, and most of that goes to the hard sciences, and we just kind of left to pick up the scraps. Yeah.
Powerful. Anis, did you want to add to that?
No, thank you. Very nicely said. As it is becoming more and more, I would say, common in Global South. I have Aminul here, who worked for a long time at a private university in Bangladesh to become a permanent lecturer. So this gig economy is extending to all private universities. But what is painful is to see the public institutions turning into gig academy, and the tenure track faculty members are choosing to cut the budget to keep their jobs and the benefits as well as increments per year. And in order to do that, in spite of the cut from the government, they had to cut money somewhere else. Therefore, less hiring in tenure track and more sessional instructors teaching courses. I was in that circle for a really long time, like 6 years, before I could get a 3-year contract. So as I really liked what Professor Sastry said, that each precarity has to be understood within its own life cycle. And I think there is a very common parallel through neoliberalism, how the life cycle or the lifetime of precarity of truck drivers or Uber drivers or sessional instructors are all connected to a common thread of global capitalism, and it's only getting worse. And as I really like the question at the end you asked, Professor, that then what can be solidarity look like in this condition? So I want to thank you all again, get the opportunity to thank you all for organizing this. This is an incredibly important topic, and the notion of methodology of Global South's own is something that demands more time and space in academic discussions, scholarly publications, and it needs more visibility. And I'm sad that there were not more people, but probably they will be catching up with watching the streaming later on.
Kaur, thank you so much. I want to return to the panel and ask you if you have something else to add as we wrap up.
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm trying to not like add to the doom and gloom that we've. It's tough to think about solidarity, Mohan, especially when it comes to academic jobs, right? Because you come down to very real sort of material questions, right? So when you see that a grad student is doing, is driving an Uber on the weekends, how do you get off your high horse and ask them to read high theory, right? And then judge them on that when they're doing this on the side. So, in that material sense, and there are times where I feel like, this whole thing is just the sideshow for like football, right? Like everything in this university is just a sideshow for a football game, which is clearly where. So part of the challenge is taking up those fights, I think, like really being unpopular within the academe and getting to a point where you use that position of whatever tenure, if it means anything, of security of a voice, is to be unpopular on campuses. That seems to be the only, just to rabble rouse as much as you can. I mean, the identification thing is so real, and you see that, and it's just a matter of like, it's a lottery whether you fall this side or the other, right? We know so many really, really smart people who just at that point that year it didn't line up, and now they're caught up in these precarity chains. So it's really not based on work and your work and your sort of quote unquote merit. It's so much of like roulette. So I guess solidarity then means being able to constantly keep the structure accountable, but knowing fully well that there is that's such an uphill thing, because as I said, it feels like a sideshow almost. The research and education seems like that. So I mean, yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if that's a good place to end, but that was just my rant.
Thank you. Something that relates to that, Shaunak, also is the number, and this connects with what Leon was saying, is the number of PhDs, for instance, graduate programs taken. How many PhDs should graduate programs produce, and how is that connected to actual pathways for people that you're taking in? I mean, Tarawa, we, for instance, have a fairly profitable use and throw culture with international students, that are brought in, putting in substantive. It makes me think of our migrant workers. In fact, Satveer, they take in debt, they go into various forms of debt to come in. They get a degree, and then you will see students, many Indian students, for instance, having graduated with an undergraduate degree, and then working in a restaurant, in an Indian restaurant, being exploited, with below living wage. So it's this whole thing about what does academia need to sustain itself, all the way from PhDs to students, and what pathways of mobility does it create?
Yeah, this is such a moment of dissonance, Mohan.
Shaunak, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, you hit a chord, Mohan. So the state of Ohio has just last week approved a new PhD program in our school. So we are doing, potentially, we might have a communication PhD in the Department of Communication at UC. And it is such a mixed kind of feeling. On the one hand, we have always wanted to have that, but we have to also be very clear about what that means. How many people will we take in, or what is our alt-ac plan? Because now people talk about like, what are the skills that you are promising, right? As Leon was saying, what do you want people to take away? So I don't know that and that's a question, and the real weird part for all of us, Mohan, is through the process, we had like literally no questions through the system. There was really no serious question about, well, how are these people going to get jobs? And we were like, is it like, we were almost kind of confused about how can this happen? Like we thought that there would be at some point somebody would ask, what is the sustainability plan for this? But through the Ohio Board of Regents, they're like, yeah, go with it, let's do it. And so because that, communication PhD students are great cheap labor, right? They teach these large classes, they teach speech, they do a whole bunch of service. So part of the news is also, I don't know, it's certainly a mixed feeling.
Thank you. Satveer and Leon, any parting thoughts?
I'm just sort of digesting all of this, and also being on the job market myself. Uh, this is a very interesting conversation for me. And then also to be doing the work that I do, which is very precarious, and then speaking about it. So all of this information, or all this entire conversation, I think is not, I mean, I already kind of knew that, but I think it's important that we then move towards building mechanisms where, you know, you don't create these systems, right? Like what you mentioned, international students, for example, graduating because it benefits the university rather than the student, and then they go on to work in precarious labor, right? I mean, I don't have an answer to that question, but I think more of these conversations need to happen at a wider scale. I think like this just shouldn't be a one-off conference session, right? How do we build this towards a larger momentum for ICA, NCA to think about why are we churning out, do PhD scholars, for example, know the risk, or should they be made known of the risk of where the field is going, you know, and the ways in which adjuncts are being churned out and the precarious nature of adjuncts. So yeah, I think all of this is for me a bit of a processing rather than to have any salient input at this point, but also thinking about growing this conversation. Yeah.
Yora, thanks, Satveer.
Yeah, I just totally agree there. It would be great to have built this. It's been so great to have this conversation. It'd be great to have further conversations where we build on this and maybe think about getting the voices of precarious academics from different countries together to talk about their experiences. Would be fantastic.
Well, that brings us to a wrap. I just want to thank each one of you so much for bravely participating in this wrap-up panel that really sets the tone for the future in many ways. And I think what you are talking about is the need for building platforms and infrastructures and recognizing that precarity, you know, and I go back to the words of Leonie Pihama, who says that our activism is not just out there, it is in here. And I guess with precarity, the question is, how do we transform the politics that is in here in these spaces? So thank you once again. So lovely to see you all. Thanks to our global audience that has hung through. And thank you so much, both of you, for being here with us. And most importantly, thank you, Richard, for helping with all the camera work. And I know it's been disappointing for you that the camera didn't quite work today, but hey, you have given us wonderful technology, and thank you, Breeze, for really holding everything together for this workshop. So take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to meet you all.
See you all.